December 19th, 1944. A cold, gray morning in Verdun, France. Inside a damp stone barracks that still smelled of the last war, the most powerful generals of the Allied armies sat around a long wooden table, and every single one of them looked like a man attending a funeral. 3 days earlier, 250,000 German soldiers had come screaming out of the Ardennes forest in the largest surprise attack the Western Front had ever seen. American lines had been torn open. Entire regiments had vanished. Panzer columns were driving deep into Belgium, and somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a small crossroads town called Bastogne was about to be swallowed whole, along with thousands of American soldiers who had been ordered to hold it. Dwight Eisenhower looked around the room and told his commanders that this would be treated as an opportunity, not a disaster. Then he turned to one man, the one general at the table who did not look afraid, and asked him a question that would decide the fate of the entire Western Front. How soon could he attack? Every officer in that room expected an answer measured in weeks. What they heard instead made some of them laugh out loud, because it sounded impossible. It sounded insane. 48 hours, the man said. 3 divisions. 48 hours. The man was George S. Patton, and what nobody in that room knew, not even Eisenhower, was that Patton had already set the machine in motion before he ever walked through the door. And within 1 week, the men trapped in Bastogne, freezing, surrounded, outnumbered, and refusing every demand to give up their ground, would find out exactly what happens when George Patton decides that his soldiers will not be left to die. To understand what Patton did, you first have to understand what almost nobody else saw coming. In the middle of December 1944, the Allied High Command believed the war was nearly over. Paris had been liberated. The German army had been bled white in Normandy and chased across France. Intelligence officers at the highest levels were writing reports saying the enemy was finished, that Germany no longer had the fuel, the men, or the will to launch a major offensive. The Ardennes forest, a rugged region of hills and pines along the Belgian and Luxembourg border, was considered so quiet that it was nicknamed the Ghost Front. It was where exhausted divisions were sent to rest, and where brand new divisions were sent to learn. The line there was stretched thin, dangerously thin, held by green troops who had never heard a shot fired in anger, and by veterans so worn down they could barely stand. But in the headquarters of Patton's Third Army, far to the south in the Saar region, one man refused to relax. His name was Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's chief of intelligence, a quiet, methodical officer who did not care what the optimists in Paris and London were saying. Koch had been tracking something that made his skin crawl. German divisions were disappearing from the front, not being destroyed, disappearing. Panzer units that should have been facing Third Army were being pulled out of the line and vanishing into radio silence. Fresh formations were being detected in the Eifel region, the wooded German ground directly across from the Ardennes, and then they too went quiet. Trains were moving at night. River crossing equipment was being stockpiled. To Koch, the pattern was unmistakable. Somebody was building a fist in the dark, and that fist was aimed at the weakest sector of the entire Allied line. On December 9th, 1944, a full week before the storm broke, Koch stood in front of Patton and laid it all out. The German buildup opposite the Ardennes, the thin American line, the possibility of a major enemy offensive exactly where nobody expected one. Other headquarters had seen fragments of the same intelligence and dismissed it. Patton did not dismiss it. He sat with it. He turned it over in that strange, restless mind of his, the mind of a man who had spent his entire life studying every battle from Cannae to Verdun, and he made a decision that would later look like prophecy. He ordered his staff to quietly prepare contingency plans. If the Germans hit the Ardennes, what would it take for Third Army to stop its own offensive in the Saar, pull out of contact with the enemy, pivot 90 degrees, and attack north into the flank of the German penetration? His staff went to work in secret. Routes were studied. Supply points were mapped. Phone codes were prepared so that entire corps could be redirected with a single short call. Patton was doing something almost no commander in history has ever done. He was planning to win a battle that had not started yet. Then, at 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the eastern sky along an 85-mile front lit up with the muzzle flashes of nearly 2,000 German guns, and the ghost front exploded. The attack was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, and it was Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men in the initial assault, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, came crashing through the snow-covered forests, where the Americans were weakest. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, spearheaded by fanatical SS divisions, drove for the Meuse River. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, perhaps the most skilled tactician Germany still had, sliced through the American 28th and 106th Divisions like a blade through canvas. 2 entire regiments of the 106th, thousands of young Americans who had been on the front line for less than a week, were encircled on a ridge called the Schnee Eifel and forced to surrender in one of the largest mass capitulations in American military history. The goal of the offensive was breathtaking in its ambition. Punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and drive all the way to the port of Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies apart and forcing the Western Allies to the negotiating table. For the first 48 hours, chaos reigned. Communications collapsed. Rear echelon units were overrun. English-speaking German commandos in American uniforms slipped behind the lines, changing road signs and spreading panic. And soon, American military police were stopping generals at checkpoints and quizzing them on baseball scores to prove they weren't infiltrators. Rumors flew that assassination teams were hunting Eisenhower himself. Fog and low clouds smothered the battlefield, grounding the Allied air forces, the one weapon the Germans feared most. And through that fog, the panzers kept coming. But even in those first desperate hours, the German timetable was already bleeding to death. And it was bleeding because of something no plan can fully account for. Small groups of American soldiers, cut off, surrounded, outgunned, and freezing, simply refused to quit. Engineers with rifles and demolition charges held bridges for hours against tank columns. Clerks and cooks and bandsmen were handed weapons and thrown into the line. On the northern shoulder, at a place called Elsenborn Ridge, American infantry and artillery slammed the door in the face of the SS and never let it open. Every hour those men bought with their lives was an hour the German spearheads sat idling on narrow forest roads, burning fuel they could not replace. And in the center of the map, at the junction of 7 roads that every German commander needed, and every American commander suddenly could not afford to lose, sat Bastogne. Bastogne was not famous. It was a modest Belgian market town of a few thousand people, the kind of place armies pass through without remembering its name. But in the Ardennes, roads are everything. The terrain funnels any large mechanized force onto a handful of paved routes, and in the southern half of the battlefield, nearly all of them ran through Bastogne. Manteuffel understood it. His corps commanders understood it. If the Germans took Bastogne quickly, their drive to the Meuse would have an open artery. If they didn't, their entire southern thrust would be strangled at birth. Eisenhower understood it too, and on December 17, he released his only theater reserve, 2 battered airborne divisions resting near Reims after months of brutal fighting in Holland. The 82nd Airborne was sent north. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, was sent to Bastogne. What happened next was one of the most remarkable road movements of the war. The division's commander, Maxwell Taylor, was away in Washington, so command fell to the division artillery officer, a compact, unassuming brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe. The men of the 101st were exhausted, under-equipped, short on winter clothing, short on ammunition, some of them without helmets or rifles, and they were loaded into open cattle trucks in the freezing dark and driven 100 miles at breakneck speed, headlights blazing in defiance of every blackout rule, because speed now mattered more than secrecy. Paratroopers marching into Bastogne passed shattered American units streaming out the other way, and they did something that became legend. They stopped the retreating men and asked them for their ammunition. "You're going the wrong way. one paratrooper reportedly told the men falling back. "We're going to be surrounded again." For the 101st, being surrounded wasn't a catastrophe. It was Tuesday. They were not alone. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, under Colonel William Roberts, had reached Bastogne first, and Roberts split his tanks into small teams and threw them out onto the eastern roads as breakwaters. Team Cherry, Team de Sobry, Team O'Hara. These little bands of Shermans and half-tracks and armored infantry met the leading panzer divisions head-on in villages like Longville and Neuville, and they were shredded, but they did not break cheaply. At Neuville, a handful of tanks and paratroopers held off an entire panzer division for the better part of 2 days, in fog so thick that men fired at engine sounds. The defenders paid a terrible price and finally fell back into the Bastogne perimeter, but they had done something priceless. They had stolen time, and time was the one thing the German offensive could not afford to lose. By December 21, the ring closed. German armor swung around both flanks of the town, cut the last roads, and Bastogne was surrounded. Inside the perimeter were roughly 18,000 Americans, paratroopers, tankers, gunners, engineers, and hundreds of stragglers from broken units who had been gathered up, rearmed, and fed back into the line. Outside were elements of several German divisions, with more arriving. The math was ugly and getting uglier. The defenders were outnumbered. Artillery ammunition was so scarce that gun crews were rationed to a handful of rounds per day, and one battery commander was told, only half joking, not to fire unless he could see 400 Germans in the open. Medical supplies had been captured when a German raid overran the division's field hospital, leaving the wounded lying on straw in cellars and a church, tended by surgeons who had almost nothing left to work with except courage and a Congolese-born Belgian nurse named Augusta Chiwi, and a young local woman named Renée Lemaire, who worked themselves to the edge of collapse, caring for men they had never met. The temperature kept falling, snow kept coming, frostbite began claiming as many men as bullets. And still, when the question of pulling out was raised in those first chaotic days, the answer from the men holding the line had been simple and unprintable. They were not leaving. Then, on December 22nd, something happened that turned a desperate siege into an American legend. Around 11:30 that morning, 4 Germans, 2 officers, and 2 enlisted men walked up the Arlon Road under a white flag. They carried a formal, typed ultimatum from the German commander to the American commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The letter was polite, almost courtly, and utterly lethal. The fortune of war, it said, was changing. Bastogne was surrounded by strong German armored units. There was only one possibility to save the encircled American troops from total annihilation, and that was honorable surrender. The Americans had 2 hours to think it over. If they refused, German artillery would annihilate the town, and the civilian losses, the letter noted with cold delicacy, would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The message was carried back through the lines to McAuliffe's command post in the cellar of an old Belgian army barracks. McAuliffe, groggy, stepping out of the first sleep he'd had in days, was told the Germans had sent a message. He assumed at first they wanted to surrender to him. When it was explained that they were demanding his surrender, McAuliffe looked at the paper, let out a short, disgusted laugh, said one word, and dropped it on the floor. The word was nuts. Then he walked out to congratulate some of his men, and only later, when his staff reminded him that the German envoys were still waiting and protocol required a written reply, did McAuliffe sit down with a pencil, stumped for what to say. One of his officers, Colonel Harry Kennard, spoke up. "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat," he said. And so the official reply of the United States Army, typed on a single sheet and handed back to the German emissaries, read in its entirety, "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander. The German officers stared at the paper in genuine confusion. "What does this mean?" one of them asked. "Is it affirmative or negative?" Colonel Joseph Harper, the American officer delivering it, decided to make sure nothing was lost in translation. "It means," he told them, "the same as go to hell, and I will tell you something else. If you continue to attack, "We will kill every German that tries to break into this city." Then, in a strange final flourish of battlefield courtesy, he wished them good luck as he sent them back to their own lines. Word of the reply spread through the frozen foxholes of the perimeter within hours, and the effect was electric. Starving, freezing, nearly out of ammunition, the defenders of Bastogne now knew exactly what their commander thought of the idea of quitting, because he had put it in writing. They were not going to retreat. They were not going to surrender. They were going to hold that town or die in it. And 100 miles to the south, when the story of the one-word reply reached the headquarters of Third Army, George Patton threw back his head and laughed with pure delight. "A man after my own heart," he said. "Any man who is that eloquent deserves to be rescued." But here is what the men in Bastogne did not know as they crouched in the snow that night. The rescue was already coming, and it had been coming for days, moving through ice and darkness in one of the most audacious maneuvers in the history of modern warfare. Because the story of Bastogne is not only the story of the men who refused to leave, it is the story of what one general did the moment he learned they were staying. Go back to that room in Verdun on December 19th, because what happened there deserves to be seen up close. The mood when Eisenhower walked in was funereal. Maps showed German spearheads plunging 50 miles into Belgium. Nobody knew where the penetration would stop. Some staff officers were quietly discussing whether Paris itself might be threatened. Eisenhower, to his enormous credit, refused to let the room drown. "The present situation," he told his commanders, "is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table." And from the far end of the table came a voice that cut through the gloom like a bayonet. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris," Patton said. "Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." A few men laughed. The tension cracked. And Eisenhower, who had known Patton for 25 years, through triumphs and scandals and near-firings, turned to him with the question that mattered. "George, how soon can you attack?" Patton's answer became the stuff of legend. On December 22nd, he said, "With 3 divisions." There was an audible stir in the room. Some officers thought he was grandstanding again, the old showman playing to the crowd at the worst possible moment. What Patton was proposing violated everything the textbooks said was possible. Third Army was at that moment locked in combat facing east, in the middle of its own offensive against the Siegfried Line. To do what he promised, he would have to break contact with the enemy along a whole army front, something armies historically do at terrible cost, pivot a force of well over 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles 90 degrees, move them up to 150 miles over ice-covered roads in the dead of winter, resupply them, reorient every gun, every field hospital, every fuel dump, every signal wire, and then launch a coordinated attack into the flank of a victorious enemy. In 48 hours, Eisenhower himself pushed back, telling Patton not to be fatuous, urging him to wait and attack with more strength. But Patton wasn't guessing, and he wasn't performing. He was the only man in the room who had done his homework. His staff had been wargaming exactly this scenario for over a week, ever since Koch's warning. Before leaving for Verdun that morning, Patton had worked out 3 complete operational variants with his staff and arranged a simple code. When he stepped out of the conference and got Third Army headquarters on the phone, he spoke 2 words, a prearranged code name, and hung up. 100 miles away, the entire machinery of an army lurched into motion. Divisions received their new orders while their commander was still standing in Verdun. Patton walked back in, lit a fresh cigar, and pointed at the German bulge on the map. "This time the Kraut has stuck his head in a meat grinder," he said, "and this time I've got hold of the handle." What followed over the next 72 hours was, by the estimation of soldiers and historians on both sides of the war, one of the most astonishing feats of military movement ever attempted. Third Army did not simply march north. It performed something closer to surgery at highway speed. The 4th Armored Division pulled out of the line and covered over 100 miles in 19 hours. The 80th Infantry Division moved similar distances with barely a pause. The 26th Infantry Division, full of green replacements, was thrown onto the roads with the rest. All told, in less than a week, Patton shifted hundreds of thousands of men and their vehicles, guns, and supplies onto a new axis of attack, over roads glazed with ice, through snowstorms, with military police standing at frozen crossroads around the clock, waving endless columns through the dark. Trucks drove with headlights on at night, enemy aircraft be damned, because Patton had calculated that speed would save more lives than blackout discipline. Behind the combat units, his logisticians rerouted tens of thousands of tons of supplies, relayed thousands of miles of signal wire, and repositioned entire hospitals. 19th century armies took weeks to change front. Patton's army did it in days, in the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, and the Germans, whose own intelligence had assured them that no major American force could intervene from the south in less than a week or two, simply did not believe it was happening until it hit them. Patton himself was everywhere during those days, and this is a part of the story that the men who lived it never forgot. He did not run the maneuver from behind a desk. He climbed into an open jeep, in weather so cold that staff officers wrapped themselves in blankets just across a courtyard, and he drove up and down the icy columns for hours every day, standing in the vehicle, red-faced in the wind, waving his troops north. He wanted every private hauling ammunition through that frozen darkness to see his army commander sharing the cold with him. He visited command posts by day and read the Bible and his history books by night, and in his diary he confessed what he would never say aloud, that this was the biggest gamble of his life, that if the attack failed, the war might drag on for months, and his career would be finished. Then he wrote a sentence that tells you everything about who he was. "If they hit us hard," he wrote of the Germans, "so much the better." He wanted them to come. There was one enemy, however, that Patton could not outdrive, outplan, or outfight, and it was the sky. The same freezing overcast that had grounded Allied air power since December 16 was strangling his attack before it began. His fighter bombers sat useless on airfields. The transports that could drop ammunition and medicine into Bastogne could not fly. His tank columns were advancing blind into country, where every tree line could hide an anti-tank gun. And so, in one of the most famous and strangest episodes of the entire war, Patton picked up the phone and called his chaplain. He wanted a prayer, not a prayer for victory, a prayer for good weather. The chaplain, a Catholic priest named Father James O'Neill, gently pointed out that it was not exactly standard practice to pray for clear skies so that men could kill other men more efficiently. Patton was unmoved. O'Neill wrote the prayer. It asked Almighty God, of His great goodness, to restrain the immoderate rains and grant fair weather for battle, so that armed with His power, the army might advance from victory to victory and crush the wickedness of its enemies. Patton ordered 250,000 copies printed on small cards, one for every soldier in Third Army, with a Christmas greeting from the commanding general on the reverse, and had them distributed through the ranks as the columns rolled north. And then, on the morning of December 23, the men of Third Army woke to something they had not seen in more than a week. The clouds broke. The sun came out over the Ardennes, hard and brilliant on the snow, and the sky filled with the silver contrails of thousands of Allied aircraft. It was a coincidence of meteorology, a Russian high-pressure system sliding west. But try telling that to the soldiers holding those prayer cards, or to Patton, who looked up at that sky and declared it a straight answer from the Almighty. He later summoned Father O'Neill, told him he was the most popular man in headquarters because God was on direct call to him, decorated him with the Bronze Star on the spot, and, in his own words, sent him on his way. Whatever one believes about the theology, the military effect was cataclysmic. C-47 transports began thundering over Bastogne in waves, and the sky above the besieged town bloomed with hundreds of parachutes in red and yellow and blue, each color a different cargo, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, drifting down onto the snow, while paratroopers cheered from their foxholes and German gunners raged. Fighter bombers fell on the German columns ringing the town and on the supply roads stretching back toward Germany, and they did not stop. For the panzer divisions, already running on fumes, the clear sky was a death sentence delivered in daylight. But the airdrops could only keep Bastogne breathing. They could not save it. The Germans, understanding that the town had now become a symbol as much as a road junction, threw fresh forces into the ring and began squeezing. On Christmas Eve, the Luftwaffe bombed Bastogne itself, and one of the bombs made a direct hit on the aid station where the wounded lay in the straw. Renée Lemaire, the young Belgian nurse the paratroopers had nicknamed the Angel of Bastogne, was killed along with dozens of the wounded men she had refused to abandon. On Christmas morning, before dawn, German tanks with infantry riding on their decks smashed into the western perimeter in the heaviest assault of the siege, and for a few hours, panzers were loose inside the American lines, driving toward the town, before tank destroyers, artillery firing over open sights, and paratroopers with bazookas hunted down and killed every single one of them in the snow-covered fields around the village of Champs. When the sun rose on Christmas Day, the perimeter had held again, but everyone inside it could do the arithmetic. Ammunition was nearly gone. The wounded were dying for lack of surgery. McAuliffe, the man who had answered annihilation with a single word, got on the radio net to the relief force and allowed himself one sentence that carried all the weight he would never show his men. "We have been let down," he said. "The finest Christmas present the 101st could get would be a relief tomorrow." The men driving north through the snow heard him, and their commander had already made them a promise. Patton's attack had jumped off on the morning of December 22nd, exactly as he had promised in Verdun, and it is important to be honest about what happened next, because the truth is more dramatic than any legend. The attack did not slice through to Bastogne in a day. It became a brutal, grinding, freezing slugging match, and for 4 days it hung in the balance. 3 divisions of Milliken's 3rd Corps went forward abreast on a 20-mile front. The 80th Infantry on the right, the 26th in the center, the 4th Armored, Patton's favorite, his spearhead, on the left, aimed up the highway from Arlon toward Bastogne, roughly 20 miles away. 20 miles. On a summer road with no opposition, an hour's drive. In the Ardennes in December 1944, it was a lifetime. The country between Arlon and Bastogne was made for defense: steep wooded ridges, deep stream cuts, stone-built villages sitting on every road like corks in bottles, all of it under deep snow and glare ice that sent 30-ton Shermans sliding into ditches. The German 5th Parachute Division and supporting units dug into those villages and made the Americans pay for every one of them. Tanks could barely maneuver off the roads. Infantry waded through snow up to their thighs in temperatures that froze the wounded to death where they fell and froze rifles until they would not fire. Villages like Martelange and Warnach and Chaumont changed hands in savage close-quarters fighting, and at Chaumont, a German counterattack with assault guns threw the Americans back out of a village they had bled to take, a defeat that stung the whole corps. Patton, who had promised Eisenhower speed, watched his columns measure their progress in single-digit miles per day and burned with frustration. His diary from those days swings between fury and iron resolve. "This has been a very bad Christmas," he wrote on December 25th, with the attack stalled and the Germans still hammering at Bastogne. But he never once considered stopping, and he refused to let his commanders consider it either. "Drive like hell," he told them. The men in Bastogne were holding their end of the bargain. Third Army would hold its end or die trying. And then Patton did something that separates great commanders from stubborn ones. He let his plan bend. The 4th Armored's 2 lead combat commands were bogged down on the direct roads, so the division's reserve, Combat Command R, was swung wide to the west, onto a secondary road running up through Neufchâteau, looking for a soft spot in the German ring. Leading its tanks was a cigar-chewing 29-year-old lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, a man Patton once said was his only peer as a tank commander, a man whose name would one day be welded onto the main battle tank of the United States Army. By the afternoon of December 26, Abrams's battalion had fought its way to a low ridge near the village of Assenois, and from that ridge, through the winter haze, his men could see it. Bastogne, 3 miles away. Between them and the town lay Assenois itself, held by German infantry and guns, and Abrams's orders were cautious, consolidate, wait, build up strength. His tanks were worn, his ammunition low, his infantry thinned by days of fighting. The safe move was to stop. Abrams looked at the sky, where C-47s were dropping supplies into the besieged town, chewed his cigar, and made the kind of decision Patton had spent his whole career teaching his officers to make. To hell with waiting. We're going into those people now. He stacked every artillery battery in range onto the village of Assiniboia, 10 batteries firing as fast as the gunners could load, and sent a spearhead of Shermans and armored infantry charging straight up the road into their own falling shell fire, because arriving with the last round still landing was the only way to hit the defenders before they could get their heads up. Leading the charge was Lieutenant Charles Boggess of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, in a brand new Sherman Jumbo named Cobra King. The column roared through Assiniboia in a chaos of smoke, snow, and point-blank fire, machine gunning German infantry as they spilled from the houses, grinding through the village and out the other side. And then Boggess was in open country, guns blazing, racing past a pillbox that his gunner destroyed with 3 quick rounds, and suddenly he saw men in the tree line ahead, wearing American uniforms, crouched in foxholes, staring in disbelief at the tanks materializing out of the German lines. Boggess stood up in his turret and shouted into the freezing air, "Come here, come on out. This is the 4th Armored." For a long moment, nobody moved, the men in the holes suspecting a German trick. Then a lone figure climbed out and walked toward the tank, and a lieutenant of the 326th Airborne Engineers reached up, shook the hand of Charles Boggess, and said the words the whole free world had been waiting 5 days to hear. "Glad to see you." It was 4:50 in the afternoon, December 26, 1944. The siege of Bastogne was broken. A few minutes later, McAuliffe himself was at the perimeter to greet the relief column, and his welcome was perfectly in character, dry as the frozen air. "Gee," he said, "I am mighty glad to see you." That night, armored ambulances and supply trucks began running the gauntlet up the narrow corridor Abrams had punched through, hauling ammunition in and the hundreds of accumulated wounded out, while German shells hunted the road in the dark. The corridor was barely 300 yards wide in places, a thread of salvation through a still furious enemy, but it held, and it widened, and through it the lifeblood of an army began to flow. The men who refused to retreat had been answered by an army that refused to stop. If the story ended there, it would already be one of the greatest in American military history. But it did not end there, and Patton would have been the first to say so. He wrote in those days that the relief of Bastogne was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of the counterblow, and the fighting that followed was in many ways more vicious than the siege itself. Hitler, enraged that the town had held, made the fatal decision to double down, and in the first days of January 1945, he hurled fresh divisions, including elite SS Panzer units pulled from the northern sector, at the narrow American corridor, determined to slam the ring shut again and take Bastogne once and for all. What had been a road junction was now a bleeding wound into which both sides poured men. The battles fought around Bastogne in that first week of January, in blizzards, at 20 below zero, were among the most savage of the entire European war, and the town that had survived the siege now had to survive the counterattack. It did. Patton fed in reinforcements, took the punches, and hit back, and in his diary he paid the enemy a soldier's grim respect while promising their destruction. "We can still lose this war," he had written at the height of the crisis, a sentence that should be remembered by anyone who thinks the outcome ever felt inevitable to the men living it. But the Germans were spending their last irreplaceable reserves of men, tanks, and fuel against an enemy who was growing stronger every day, and Patton knew it. The meat grinder was turning, and he had the handle. Through January, 3rd Army attacked north from Bastogne, while 1st Army attacked south from the other shoulder of the Bulge, two jaws closing in weather so cruel that vehicles had to be run every half hour to keep engines from freezing solid, and men learned to check each other's faces for the white patches of frostbite. On January 16, 1945, Patrols of the two armies met at the shattered town of Houffalize, and the bulge was formally erased. By the end of the month, the front line stood where it had on December 15th, as if the German offensive had never happened, except for what it had cost. 19,000 Americans dead, tens of thousands more wounded, captured or maimed by the cold, the bloodiest single battle in the history of the United States Army. And on the other side of the ledger, the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserve in the West, the tanks, the veterans, the fuel, the irreplaceable core of Hitler's remaining strength, gone, burned away in the snow of the Ardennes. Germany surrendered less than 4 months later. Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons and called the Ardennes an ever-famous American victory, the greatest American battle of the war. And military professionals, including Germans who had spent the war deriding American generalship, pointed to one maneuver above all, the 90-degree pivot of Third Army, as the moment they understood the war was truly lost. Patton himself, a man not famous for understatement, wrote that the relief of Bastogne was the most brilliant operation Third Army had ever performed, and then added the sentence that mattered more to him than any praise. The results attained, he told his troops in a general order, were made possible only by your dauntless courage. He knew, better than anyone, that his 48-hour miracle at Verdun would have meant nothing if 18,000 freezing men at a Belgian crossroads had not looked annihilation in the face and answered it with a single word. There is one final scene, and history wrote it with a cruelty and a poetry that no scriptwriter would dare invent. Patton survived the war he had spent his whole strange, driven life preparing for. He did not survive the peace. On December 9, 1945, almost 1 year to the week after Oscar Koch first warned him about the Ghost Front, Patton's staff car collided with an army truck on a road in occupied Germany. It was a low-speed accident. No one else was seriously hurt. But Patton's neck was broken, and 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, 1 year to the day after his columns were grinding north through the ice toward Bastogne, George S. Patton died quietly in his sleep in a hospital in Heidelberg. He was buried, at his family's wish, not in America, but in the American Military Cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg, in the ground his army had fought across, laid at the head of the endless white crosses of Third Army soldiers, the position, his widow said, he would have wanted, still leading his men. Many of those men lying around him fell in the Ardennes, in the drive north, on the frozen roads to Bastogne. He is with them today. So when you ask what Patton did after his soldiers refused to retreat, the answer is not just a maneuver, not just a battle, not even just a rescue. He had prepared for a catastrophe no one else believed in. He had promised the impossible in a room full of doubt and then delivered it through ice and darkness. He had turned an entire army on its heel like a cavalry troop and driven it into the flank of the last great German offensive of the war, because somewhere out there in the snow, surrounded and starving, his soldiers had looked at a demand for surrender and laughed at it. They refused to retreat, so he refused to leave them. And in that frozen December, between the men who would not quit the town and the general who would not quit the men, the German army's last hope in the West was crushed forever, at a little Belgian crossroads whose name the world will never forget.